All right, let's get started. So we're starting homework 2 content today. So everything with homework 1, this has been true for almost a week, but everything for homework 1, you have homework 1 deadline was already passed. Obviously this is true. But you've had everything for homework 1 that you needed for a week now. Hopefully you all did fantastic with the deadline. My grading deadline for the TAs is at the absolute latest 1 week after the deadline. So at least by the project part 1 deadline, you'll get your results. So that allows you 1 full week to work on anything that you need to work on. If you didn't get full credit, it gives you 1 full week to get in for that late deadline. So we'll be grading and getting those results to you within the next week. Hopefully you all did great. Homework 1 is the best way to word this. Homework 1 is, I think, a pretty easy, ease into the course. Homework 2 is out. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that homework 2 is the same difficulty as homework 1. Homework 2 is where the course is really going to actually start. You're comfortable with HTTP. You've got your hands on Docker. You know what's going on, how to set up your TCP. All the basics are out there. You know how to get HTTP requests, respond, all that good stuff. Now we're going to start using that for quite a bit of stuff. We're going to have authenticated chat is the ultimate goal of this homework. First, you're going to build unauthenticated chat where everybody is just a guest. Anybody can just punch into chat and have their chat messages show up. This is going to include parsing post requests, polling a database, not necessarily SQL, but you'll have to have a database running to be able to store your chat history. Quite a bit going on just from the first objective. Objective 2 is to add authentication. Users can register and log in. And then once they're logged in, when they, I don't know what I'm pointing to here, but then when they send messages to chat, their username should be associated with their chat messages. And finally, deleting messages. Users can delete messages. Every message will have a button with an X next to it. Once you start playing around with the site, you'll see that. Oh, I didn't even mention, but the repo that you cloned for your first project, I updated the front end of the site to be suitable for homework 2 handout. So you're not building. You might have to make some modifications, especially if you want to make it your own. You shouldn't have to actually, but you can. You're allowed to. But the updated front end that's suitable for homework 2 is out there, so you don't have to build your own front end for homework 2. But you are building the back end to make that front end work. That front end is going to place a button with an X next to every message that's posted to chat. Clicking that message, that X should delete a message only if you're the author of that message. So it should authenticate. It should say, hey, you're not allowed to delete that message because you didn't write it, or if you wrote it, that message should disappear. So deleting messages with authentication. So we have a feature of our app that does check your authenticated status. It does check you to make sure you're allowed to take that specific action and verifies all that stuff so other people can't delete your messages. And then the application objective, cross-site request forgery tokens. We will have a lecture on this, so it's not like the favicon where I kind of just threw it at you. But the favicon wasn't too tricky, in my opinion. There was, some of you were having issues with it, and we might have to solve this on the grading end, because when it came to office hours, I didn't really have a good answer. People asked me after lecture, I'm like, I don't know why this isn't working. If you had a leading slash on your path for the icon, that would prevent the browser from sending the request. There's something I didn't know, so on the grading end, if that's the issue with your favicon, I'll probably just give you credit for that. Might be a pain for the grading process, but I don't want to take that away from you since I couldn't really answer. It was an objective where you're supposed to research it on your own, but the documentation doesn't really shout out and say you can't have a leading slash. So I don't know how fair that one is, but I'll probably overlook that one in grading. But this is unlike that one. This one I will have lecture content. I'll show you what cross-site request forgery is. This will require you to modify the front end a bit and actually change some structure. In that, I'm not really going to cover too much. I mean, is that fair? I mean, I cover everything you need for that one too. You just got to put the things together in the right way. and then add those cross-site request forgery tokens. And that's homework 2. A lot going on here. To really even start talking about this, we need front-end development. So let's do front-end development in a day. This is something where, and project part 2, that's upcoming. It'll come out soon. Just like project part 1 and the rest of the project parts, it will mostly mirror homework 2, but with a framework. But I haven't decided exactly what I want. I don't want it just a cut and paste of homework 2, but I want that out soon. I usually like having it out right when the content starts. So I'm feeling anxious about that when I want to get it out soon. So front-end development in a day. Some web courses, like this is what they'll spend the whole semester on, is just front-end development. I think a day might be too much. And wait, let me rephrase that actually. There's a lot to talk about with front-end development. You can have a whole course on it. We do have 370, which talks about front-end development. Obviously, way more in-depth. There are courses that go all semester just talking about the mechanics. Like in today's lesson, we're going to learn what an ordered list is. I can't believe that exists. It's nuts to me. I think you're all plenty more capable than that you don't need me to spend a whole lecture on ordered lists and unordered lists. When will homework 1 grades be released? I covered that. Within a week. Oh, you asked that after I said it. Why don't you just pay attention? The LO2 says we're saving the hash of the token in the database. Are we not allowed to store the salt in the database too? If you want to salt the tokens, go for it. But logistically, that's tougher. It's more difficult. So when you have a password, you have the username that should be associated with that password. You look up the salted hash for that username, you pull that salted hash, and you smash it with the password, and check if that password is good. When you have an authentication token, you do not have that username associated with it. You don't have a username, so which salted hash do you look up? You have no real information about them because all you have is a token, not a hash token. All you have is a token, so which token do you pull to compare it with? If they're salted, you don't know which salt to append to generate the hash. So how do you look anything up? The only way to do that is to go through every stored token in your database, pull that salt, create a hash, and check if the hashes match, which is going to be an O of N operation, which if that's what you want to do, I'm not stopping you. But the salt doesn't add any security to the hashed tokens as long as you're hashing them. It doesn't add any security, so there's really no reason to have the salt. And adding the salt adds that complexity. I wouldn't expect you to have a salt on your tokens. Without the salt, you hash your token, and then you look up that specific value in your database, and you get that value right away. When will the random teams be formed? In a week. Team formation isn't due until next week, so I can't do random teams until I know what the teams are. So after the project part 1 deadline, at 9 a.m. that day, that's when I'll start forming the random teams. I'll do them that morning. I got it in my calendar to remind me to do that. I'll do it 9 a.m. that morning. If you don't submit your team formation form by 9 a.m., you're getting put on a random team, and I will not listen to complaints after that. If you had 5 weeks, you got 5 weeks to form your team. That's so much time. And I want the random teams to get started as soon as possible because they do get a pretty late start in just finding a meeting time. Like Monday morning, they get their teams. They have to have a meeting that week. I want to get them started. I'm not going to hold them up just because you forgot to fill out a form. Like, just fill out the form. All right. That's everything in chat. When does part 2 come out? Like, I just said these things. Why don't you all shut up when class starts? You'll know these things without having to ask. Goodness. So front-end development. Let's talk about it. So we're going to talk about the 3 big cornerstones, I guess, of front-end development: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We're going to see that HTML is going to be the foundation of every page. This defines the structure of a page. CSS is going to make it look cool, and JavaScript is going to give it dynamic functionality. So that's our basic high-level structure of a web page, not a web app, but a web page. So let's talk about each one of these in line, and I'm not going to go into much detail on each one of these. I need to get enough information out there for each of these to make sense. What HTML is, what CSS is, like basics of how to use them, And then as we go throughout the course, whenever I need more front-end functionality, I'll throw extra things out there. But after today, I want you to know the structure of HTML, the format, the syntax of CSS, why we use JavaScript at all. That's what I want you to get out of this lecture. So it won't be too much. And honestly, most of this stuff I would expect most of you to already know. So I don't want to spend any more than one lecture on. I could probably trim this down to half a lecture once everybody's pretty familiar with this stuff. But in case there's some of you, probably maybe some of you that haven't seen this stuff before, I do want to make sure I do cover it and not just say, go figure it out. So HTML. Like Wednesday, like today I'm just going to say what HTML is. Wednesday, I'm going to introduce HTML forms. So we are going to talk about more HTML stuff. I want to get the foundation today. So HTML, hypertext markup language. Hypertext, I mentioned this in an earlier lecture, but hypertext used to be a brand new idea. This idea that you have text that can link to other text was a phenomenal, revolutionary new thing that we could only do with computers. So once computers became a thing, it's like, whoa, we can have links. Now it's just ubiquitous. We expect everything to have links. But that's what the hypertext part of it means. Hypertext means text that can link to other text, or I guess resources in general. You can have a link to an image, sure. And markup language, meaning that HTML has special ways to indicate that there's text that should be treated differently from the rest of the text on the document. It's not a programming language. Don't call it a programming language. That's the easiest way, like in a job interview, that's the easiest way to let the interviewer know that you don't know much about web stuff. Don't call HTML a programming language. I do actually see this a lot. It seems like a silly mistake, but it's not a programming language. When you have your skills section on your resume, and under languages, you put HTML, not really thinking about it, I would assume. That says a lot on your resume. Don't do that. If I'm hiring you to be a web developer and you do that, like if you're not a web developer, I can overlook it. If you're going to be a web developer, don't. It's not a programming language. It's a markup language. It's just in the frickin' name. Markup language, not HTML. It's such a dumb mistake to make. All right, so this is HTML. This HTML document is going to make this web page. You save this as a .html file, double click it, your browser's going to say, I know what to do with this, and it's going to render it and show you this beautiful web page right here. So let's break this down a bit and talk about what's going on here. So HTML is all about elements. You have HTML elements, and elements are defined by an open tag and a close tag. Everything in between those tags is part of that element. So I have an H1 element. I start the H1 element. The content of the H1 is my first web page, and then I close that element, so that's the end of the element. And then H1 here means header 1, means my first page is going to be in bigger text than the rest of the page, but I have an element. Start the element, end the element, 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 and elements can be nested as much as you want. So I can have elements inside an element, and just keep nesting them layers on layers and layers. We can nest them as much as we want. That's one of the most powerful parts about HTML, and really the core fundamental part. That's how we structure our pages. What elements are child elements is the actual term. What elements are child elements of which other elements? What orders do they go in? That's how you're structuring your web page to make it look the way you want it to look. Or not even look the way you want it to look, but be structured the way you want it to be structured. The way you want it to look, I'll say that's part of CSS. So let's talk about a couple of these. Like I was just picking on earlier, I'm not going to belabor it and just go through every single type of element. I think you're beyond that. You can. I'm going to recommend W3 Schools throughout this whole lecture. You can hop on W3 Schools and take a look at every single element that exists in HTML, and you can use whatever ones you want, whenever you want. But I will highlight a couple ones just so we get the idea of what these things are. One, head. This is all the content that will not appear on the page. Any meta information about the page. If you're worried about search engine optimization, SEO, this is where you put your keywords and anything that helps that. Title is going to be in the head. This does not appear on the content of the page, but it does appear in the tab of the page. So whatever you want the text to be on that tab for that page, you'll put that in a title element inside the head of the HTML document. The body, that's where everything's going to go that's actually rendered on the page itself. H1, I mentioned earlier, is a big old header. You have H1 through H6, where H1 is the biggest, H6 is the smallest. And there are different levels of headers. P means paragraph, so if I have a paragraph of text, I'll put it in a P tag. That's going to give you the line breaks to make it look like a paragraph. And then div, which stands for division, which is kind of a featureless-ish section of the page. We use these a lot in web development to just say, this is a section of my page. We'll label it with a div, and then usually we'll use JavaScript and CSS to do something with those divs. So very commonly in HTML, you'll see something like this. You'll see an empty div with an ID, and then we're going to look up that ID with our JavaScript and our CSS to populate it with whatever we want to populate it with. You kind of saw this in the first front end for homework 1, where the JavaScript was grabbing an element and then appending some text to it. We're going to see that a lot. That's pretty much how all web pages work these days, is we're going to have HTML, which is pretty featureless, and then have JavaScript actually populate the data. I'll have a lot to say about this later in the semester, but since I kind of touched on it already, notice like every single website you go to these days, you go to the website and it loads usually quite fast, and there's nothing there. And then slowly all the stuff starts popping up. That's your HTML loading, and then JavaScript populating the HTML with the actual content. Usually with a whole bunch of AJAX calls to the server. That's pretty much how most modern websites work these days. We want the HTML, we want the page to load quick. If a page takes too long to load, users are going to leave before it even loads. So it loads quick and then starts populating. Because that content can take quite a while to process, to get the right content to you. There are also self-closing tags. I found out recently that you don't do these like the slashes are bad practice now, I think. But I don't know, when I learned this stuff, the slashes were good practice and leaving off your slashes was bad. I think leaving off your slashes is the right thing to do now. But anyway, there can be self-closing tags. An image tag is self-closing, meaning we don't have an open tag and a close tag. An image is just meant to be an image. We don't need to open it and close it. There's no content between the tags, so it's self-closing. A line break, horizontal rule, one of my favorite HTML elements for what it's worth. Not that anyone cares, but I love horizontal rules. It's just a horizontal line. But you see these all the time in like the course website. I'm still doing homework handouts in Google Docs in this class, but when I do HTML homework handouts, I got horizontal rules everywhere to split up the sections. So we don't need an open tag and a closed tag. For everything, some elements are self-closing. And we have HTML attributes. So we have elements defined by the open and closed tags, and attributes. Elements and attributes, that's what HTML is all about. Attributes are in the open tag and are key value pairs, where the key is always a string. Actually, the value is always a string too. Key value pairs, that lets you add extra information to that element. Here I'm giving this element an ID of my div. An ID is a specific attribute which does have special meaning. It does have to be unique. And it's going to be a weird sentence, but HTML will enforce the IDs being unique. It's not really true. It's not really a meaningful sentence. But your ID should be unique, or else you can get some weird bugs. You'll get warnings in your IDE of choice if you're using an IDE, but the page will still load. One thing about front-end stuff, HTML and CSS at least, you can have lots of errors in your HTML and CSS, and the page will still load. It'll still render. The browser will try its best to figure out what you mean and try to get something displayed to the user. It might not be exactly what you were expecting, but something will be displayed. So if you have what in programming we would usually think of as an error, where we have multiple elements with the same ID, which should be unique. The browser is still just going to render your page. But when you start having JavaScript that gets elements by IDs, you might get the wrong element and you'll have a bug later on down the road. So I'll say these should be unique if you're using ID. But attributes, elements and attributes, that's HTML. Oh yeah, and comments. I always forget about comments. For what it's worth, only block comments. We do not have line comments in HTML. And it's this bulky syntax, less than, exclamation point, dash, dash, then dash, dash, greater than, to end your comment. And that defines a block comment. The only type of comment we have in HTML. And we can have Unicode characters in our HTML. So if you have HTML, you're just typing ASCII and you don't, what would the situation for that be? I've never used this first feature for what it's worth. I would go to the internet, look up the Unicode character and cut and paste it these days. But if your editor only supports ASCII, I suppose, and you do know the Unicode bytes for the character that you want, you can use this to escape your character, ampersand, hashtag, your hex values for your character, and then semicolon, and that's going to give you the Unicode character for those bytes. Or more commonly, the one that I actually do use all the time, there are special named characters in HTML that are going to be named escaped characters like ampersand R, oh my goodness, RARR, right arrow is what it's short for, is going to be an arrow pointing to the right. So if I have this in my HTML, it's going to be rendered to the page as a right arrow. A few useful ones, non-breaking space. I actually just used this in the Homework 2 handout. If you need a quick and dirty way to add some horizontal space, non-breaking space, as long as it lines up, which it happened to in Homework 2 handout, non-breaking space is going to give you an extra space. By default, HTML will ignore additional spaces. So if I have web space page or web space, 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 enter, 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 like new line, new line, new line, and then page, it's going to be treated as one single space. It will ignore the extra white space. So if you do want extra space, if I want 3 spaces here, space, non-breaking space, space, that's going to give me 3 spaces there. Now, if you actually need a lot of horizontal space, don't do non-breaking space, non-breaking space, non-breaking space. Use some CSS at that point. I would add a span and then give that span a width to have some extra space there. But if you need a quick and dirty little bit of extra space, non-breaking space is there. And the ones we'll use, I don't remember which lecture it goes in now, but we're going to see the less than sign, the greater than sign, and the ampersand. We're going to escape those to their named equivalents. For security reasons, we're going to see a very, very bad injection attack called HTML injection that users can do when we have a chat app. We need to protect against that. And we're actually going to use this for security purposes. So this is important to know. Memorizing the Unicode characters, like I never do that. But this, I never had a reason to, I guess. But these named escaped characters will end up being crucially important. And it's an easy thing to forget on your homework. If you forget, it's a security issue and it's a 0 on that objective. So it's something we need to remember. But it ends up being actually pretty easy to do. The hardest part is remembering. Okay, and that's HTML. That's all I got to say about HTML. Like I said, as we need more elements, we'll need forms on Wednesday. I'll bring out an HTML form and I'll talk about the attributes that are specific to that. But other than that, like that's HTML. You know HTML now. If there's other HTML stuff that you're interested in, I always do recommend W3 Schools. If you have a different resource that you prefer, go for it. W3 Schools, I don't know, it's been solid for decades. It's just been a solid resource for picking up web development stuff. I don't know, I like it. But yeah, and anything else we need, there will be some things that maybe I won't mention in class. I think I do mention everything you need with HTML in lecture these days. I used to not, but I think I ended up just adding it all to the lecture because I got sick of the office hours questions. But if there is something that I don't mention, I do expect you to be able to pick that up. That's part of finding and reading documentation online. Like you should be able to do that on your own. I would expect every one of you to be able to go through W3 schools and learn about new elements, learn about tables and lists and all that stuff. But at the same time, I'm never going to require you to know that stuff, really. I guess on your project, debatably, for your project, if you want to use those elements, nothing's forcing you from using different elements that I didn't show in lecture. But anyway, that's HTML. Enter CSS. So HTML is going to be the structure. That's like the bones of our web app. And then CSS is going to make it look good. So we're going to use CSS to spice up our HTML. And it's good practice to separate this. We have our separation of concerns here. HTML is concerned with structure. Where is each element going to go in relation to the other elements on the page? CSS is worried about making them look good. CSS is going to change the styling of them. And we want to keep those separate. And we go as far as to get these in separate files. The Homework 1 handout code, the Homework 2 also, it's going to have these in separate files. So each file is concerned. The HTML file is concerned with one thing. CSS is concerned with another. JavaScript is concerned with another. We want to keep these things as separate as we can, because if we have all that stuff in one file, which HTML allows you to do, you can have style tags and script tags to have your CSS and JavaScript all in one big HTML file. You can do that. You shouldn't do that, because anything more than just a small project page, I don't know the word, but anything more than like a small pet project, once your site gets fairly complex, it's going to be a mess having all that in one file. It's not going to work out well. It's not going to be easy to maintain. That's what I'm looking for. And you're not going to be graded on the quality of your front ends. You saw the front end that I gave you for Homework 1. You're about to see the one I gave for Homework 2. I gave you a preview of it last time. I changed the color so it's not as ugly, but it's still pretty basic. It's a really basic structure. There's nothing fancy going on with it. So if that's what I'm putting out there, I'm certainly not going to grade you on the style of your stuff. I encourage you to take pride in the stuff you put out there and make it look good. But if you don't, I'm not going to affect your grade because of that. Yeah, I got nothing more to say about that. Okay, so let's look at some basic CSS. So this is CSS. This is what we would put in our CSS file. Is element name, and then in braces, the property that I want to change, and then the value of that property. It's kind of CSS. So I'm changing. There's more to it than that, but I just don't have much else to say on this slide. I mean, you can see it. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. So this is changing the background of the body of the page to aqua. Aqua is a named color. If we don't want to use a named color, we can specify the RGB values. So this would be another way of saying red. I could do color red, would be the same exact thing, but it's RGB, 2 hex characters for each, 1 byte for each. So this is 255 on the red, 0 on the green, 0 on the blue. Bless you. So I'm going to get straight up red for that color. So usually this is the more practical way to do it, unless you just want to stick with the named colors. Or I guess named colors would be more practical. This is the more versatile way to do it. You can specify your RGB values exactly. And then I'm going to change the font size. So there's tons of properties. Again, the W3 schools, you can look at all the properties that you can change. There's tons of them. There's lots of stuff going on with CSS. But this is the structure of a CSS file. Element name, or element type, I should say. And then a list of properties. And for what it's worth, each line ends with a semicolon. If you forget the semicolon on your last property, it usually doesn't care. But if you miss a semicolon on one of the middle or the first ones, it's usually going to complain about you and not give you what you want. And if I render this HTML with this CSS, I get this hideous thing here that's going to change that content. So any P element, my paragraphs are going to be large red text, and the body background is going to be aqua. And to get our style sheet linked, how we import, we would think of this as an import if we're in like any language ever. But in HTML, different syntax, different thing going on here. We're going to use this link tag. Those of you who did the favicon are very familiar with this, or if you just looked at the HTML that I gave for homework 1, it looks like this. I'm going to have a link element. It's a self-closing element. And the href, the hyperlink reference, is going to be whatever path I have hosting that file. So I have a file style.css that I'm going to host at the path style.css. For homework 1, this would be public/style.css because that's where that file is hosted. And we're going to get a GET request for this. The browser is going to take a look at our HTML, read this link, realize that there's a resource that needs to be requested, send a request for style.css. And since I'm using what's called a relative link here, I just have style.css. I don't have http://localhost 88. I don't have any of that. I have a relative path instead of an absolute path. So the protocol, host, and port are going to be the same as the protocol, host, and port that were used to request the HTML file itself. So the file that it's reading, what's the protocol, host, and port? It's going to be that same thing, but this as the path. So I'm only specifying the path. But if I wanted a resource from a different protocol, a different host, or just a different port, I can specify the absolute path and request something from any other server out there that's hosting public resources. Okay, but we got pretty big limitations with this. If I want 2 paragraphs to be different colors, guess what I can't do with this syntax? I can't do that. I want these 2 paragraphs to be different colors. So how do I get more functionality? Because usually you're not going to want every element type on an entire page, especially when we're talking divs, which are usually used to just say, here's where some stuff's going to go, here's where some other stuff's going to go. But each div on a page usually behaves very differently. So we don't want to just say every div has these properties. Every paragraph has these properties. So we want something more flexible, so enter classes. We'll add classes as attributes to the HTML elements, and now we can change the properties of those specific elements with that class in our CSS file. So now if I have a paragraph with the class red, it's going to be red text. If I have a paragraph with the class green, it's going to be green text, and I get what I want here. So this gives us more flexibility by using classes, and this is usually how CSS is used. We usually don't say every element of a specific type, except probably the body. I think I still do that with the body. But we're going to put a class on our elements and then specify the specific styling using those classes. It's really the pretty standard architecture. What was the difference between style.css and /style.css? This is the one that threw me off with the favicon questions in office hours. I think if you add the leading slash, it's trying to treat it as an absolute path, and then it gets confused because there's no protocol, host, port. It doesn't follow the format of a URL. That's my guess. But I would have preferred, if I were designing this from the ground up, I would have preferred if slash meant start from the root path on the same protocol, host, and port, and use this path as the absolute path, but relative to that same host and port. The reason I would like that is because if I'm at public, if I go localhost 8080 on your homework apps, if I go localhost 8080 /public/index.html, this is going to make a request. Oh man, I backed myself in a corner. Is it? I'm not 100% sure on this one. I think this will make a request for public/style.css. I'm pretty sure. There's something in that realm that it does. Oh man, I shouldn't have. Yeah, I'm quite certain. I'm going to go down this hole. If I'm wrong, I don't know. I don't think I'm wrong. But this would make a request for public/style.css, whereas if you go to localhost colon 8080 slash, just the root path, then this will be relative to that. So it's just going to be style.css. So if you go to your home page on your homework 1 code, and you go localhost colon 8080 slash public slash index.html, the page should not load correctly because it's not going to get your CSS and JavaScript because it's going to make requests for slash public slash style.css, and same for JavaScript. So I would prefer if a leading slash meant don't add the relative path of the resource that was requested, start over with a brand new path and have this be the absolute path. But I'm not in charge of that yet, so I don't get to make that call. And we like to make classes a little more flexible too. Instead of saying, hey, this needs to be a paragraph with the class red, we can just say, you know what? I don't care if it's a paragraph or not. If it has the class green, whatever it is, apply this styling to it. So now if I want, or I did say green. Oh yeah, because, yeah. So then anything with the class green, if I had a div with the class green, it would have green text. But I have a paragraph with the class red, that's fine, it matches this. And I have a div with the class red, which doesn't match any of my styling, so it just gets boring old plain text. But if I had a div with the class green, all I'm doing is checking, is the class green? Then it's going to get that styling applied to it. Can you have href link to any resource from any website? Yeah. I'll say yeah on that. Any resource from any website? Yeah. The website won't always respect your requests. If it's a website that says, hey, you can't just take my style.css, you can't take my JavaScript, it might not give it to you, but you can always request it. Because they'll know, they'll read the HTTP headers, and it'll say, this request is coming from localhost 8080, and it'll be like, I'm not giving you my stuff. And we can take this one step further. This one's less useful, at least, let me reword that. I don't find myself using this very often. Maybe there are places where this is common and useful, but you can specify an ID. These are special properties of attributes of HTML elements that are supposed to be unique, all that stuff. And CSS will respect this too. If you do, or not respect this, but have functionality related to IDs. If you use hashtag and then an ID name, this styling will apply just to this element and only this element. So if you want to specify specific styling to a single element, this is the way you do it. I don't find myself doing that. I'll usually just add a new class name and just only apply that class to that element, because sometime down the road I might have a second element that I want to apply the same styling to. So for my money, I don't usually do this, but it is an option. It is something you can do. And it doesn't really show up on the slides, but this is a double border. There's 2 lines. Resolution on, since I made it too small in the corner, the resolution's not enough to see it. But I added a double border around it. And you can have multiple classes. I don't have much to say about this, but I just got to get it out there. You can have multiple classes, space-separated list. It's going to give you multiple classes. So you can have stylings from multiple classes in your CSS file applied to the same element. That's CSS. So CSS, specify which elements you want the styling to apply to, usually through classes. Classes is the best way to do that. And then change the styling properties of those elements. That's at a very high level what CSS is. And then there's a whole rabbit hole of actually exploring CSS and figuring out how to do everything that you want it to do. And CSS is notoriously finicky. It's getting better these days. There's more modern updates to CSS now. It's making it a lot better. But it's notoriously finicky trying to get everything exactly where you want it to be. It's getting better though. But as always, W3 Schools is there if you want to learn more. and JavaScript. We'll use a lot of JavaScript throughout the course. So, oh yeah, I got to do this disclaimer. I'm not going to explicitly cover JavaScript syntax. At this point in your careers, you are expected to be able to pick up a language quickly, even if you haven't used JavaScript in a while or you haven't used it at all. I'm not going to go back to 1.15 and cover, okay, this is how we do a loop, this is how we do a data structure. I'm not going to do that. W3 Schools also has a good JavaScript tutorial. I'm just going to keep recommending W3 Schools. It's got a pretty good JavaScript tutorial. I think it's pretty solid. That'll go through all the basics, variable declaration, all that good stuff. But check them out if you do want a tutorial. But honestly, at this point in your careers, I wouldn't expect any of you to have too much trouble doing at least the basic things of the language. Obviously, you're not going to be able to jump in and just do really advanced things with the language. And I'm also not going to ask you to do that. I'm not going to ask you to write some front-end JavaScript that uses promises and stuff. It's just not something I'm going to make you do. Not too relevant to what we're doing in this class. But you should be able to work your way around a little bit. And I give you the front ends for the homework. Like the homework 2 front end is out there. I think for homework 3, I will make you modify the front end and do a little bit of front end work. So I give this disclaimer, but I really don't ask you to do much JavaScript for what it's worth. And when I give these disclaimers, by the way, this just means that I'm not spending lecture time on it. If you come to office hours with your questions, I'll be happy to spend time and help you with whatever you need. It just means I'm not spending lecture time going over every HTML element. If you come to my office hours and you're like, man, what's a UL? What's an LI? I'll be happy to go over those elements in HTML with you. I just want to take up lecture time more than today. So we've seen the structure of a site is HTML. That's like the bones of the site. CSS makes it look good. And with those two things, you can make what I like to call poster sites. This is great if you have some information and you want to disseminate that information to everyone with an internet connection. For example, if you have a restaurant and you want to post your menu and phone number online and say, call here to make reservations, a poster site would be great for you. That's all you need is HTML and CSS. If you're just disseminating information, the course website, for example, I don't need any JavaScript with the course website. It's a whole bunch of information that I need to give you, and there's no need for interactivity with that. So these can be great, but what we really want to do in this course, not the course website, but the course, wants to talk about making apps where the users can interact with our content. This is really what we want to build. So we're going to throw JavaScript out there to do that, to give us that interaction. It is technically ECMA script, but JavaScript is one of the only ECMA, or let me not say it that way, is the most popular implementation of ECMA script out there. So it's usually JavaScript. I'll just say JavaScript. But it's technically any implementation of ECMA script. This is the standard, and then JavaScript is one implementation of that standard that implements ECMA script. Before anyone, well, actually, it's me. I want to get that out there. Which, speaking of, HTML and CSS are not programming languages. Somebody did me on this in lecture. I had to look it up and read up about it. Technically, yes, HTML and CSS combined are a programming language in the sense that it's Turing complete. You technically can code anything with just HTML and CSS. You shouldn't, unless you're just challenging yourself and you want to, see how to actually do that and just have fun, whatever. Knock yourself out. But you really shouldn't code like that. Any enterprise software that you're going to write for your company, don't do it. It's only just for pet projects. JavaScript is your programming language. This is where we actually do programming for our front ends. Everything else, structure, style, nothing about programming, nothing about functionality. It's just deciding how your site should look. But now we want to add functionality with JavaScript. With JavaScript, being a full programming language, guess what happens when somebody visits your page with JavaScript? They download your JavaScript code and run your code on their machine. Every time you visit a site with JavaScript, you download their code and run it on your machine. There are many security implications of this. I actually have to watch the clock because my music, I have no faith that it's going to start on time. The implication of this is that that could be very dangerous code that's going to destroy your machine. So there's certain things you can't do in JavaScript. You can't read or write files, and you can't break out of your specific tab for that browser. You can't break out of that and check out anything else. And I'll clean up the rest of that next time.